And we are live. Good evening and welcome to our first MacReads of 2021 event. My name is Jenny Blackson and I am Linfield University's librarian. MacReads is an ongoing partnership between the McMinnville Public Library. Live. Good evening and welcome to our first MacReads of 2021 event. My name is Jenny Blackson and I am Linfield University's.
You have to close out of your YouTube if you're on.
MacReads is an ongoing partnership between the McMinnville Public Library. Good evening and welcome to our first MacReads of 2021 event. My name is Jenny Blackson and I am Linfield University's.
You have to close out of your YouTube if you're on.
MacReads is an ongoing partnership between the McMinnville Public Library. Good evening. My sincere apology, folks. I got involved in some kind of feedback loop there. So we'll start again. Good evening. My name is Jenny Blackson, and I am the University Librarian at Linfield. MacReads is an ongoing partnership between the McMinnville Public Library, Linfield University Libraries, and 3rd Street Books. This year's program will take you on a 3-month journey to reflect on the role of racism in our daily lives and in our community. It is not our intention to shame anyone or to call anyone racist. Instead, we would like to explore ways in which each of us can become an anti-racist through films, books, and conversations. This month, we are featuring the film series Race and the Power of an Illusion. You can access that through the McMinnville Public Library, either on DVD checkout or streaming. And if you're a Linfield Libraries patron, you can also check that out on DVD or stream. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome 2 members of the Linfield University's faculty. Dr. Shanna Bowman is an assistant professor of biology in the College of Arts and Sciences at Linfield University. She researches the cell biology of skin pigmentation and melanoma skin cancer. She received her Ph.D. from Carnegie Mellon University, studying opiate addiction in neurons. Before coming to Linfield, Shanna was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, studying cell biology and albinism. She'll be speaking tonight on the biology of skin pigmentation. Dr. Natalie Welch is a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, originally from the Aquila boundary of Western North Carolina. Natalie is currently an assistant professor of sports management in the School of Business at Linfield University. She received her PhD from the University of Tennessee. Go Vols! Natalie is passionate about advocating for Indigenous athletes and equity across all sports. She also works as a producer, consultant, and hosts the Creative Native podcast. She will be speaking tonight on racism in sports. Please join us next Monday when Linfield professor Dr. Leonard Finkelman will talk about the role of science in the creation of racism. You can check out our website for updates on our March and April programming. And with that, Shanna, I'm going to let you take it away.
I think Natalie was planning on going first. If she still wants to, we'll go with that, but I'm fine with whatever she wants.
Yeah.
You want to go first, Natalie?
Yeah, I'll go for it. Let's do it. All right, I'm going to share my screen here and get my presentation up. Hope everyone is having a good evening. Is that working? Just yell at me if it's not. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, and so for everyone, I feel like a lot of the country right now is under a winter storm watch or warning, or it's pretty dicey out there. So I hope everybody is staying safe. huge thanks goes out to here in McMinnville, all of our people working on power lines and cleaning up all the debris with the wood and the trees. So heart goes out to you guys to doing all that hard work. But welcome. Yes, Shio, hello. My name is Natalie Welch. I am, as Jenny said, I'm a professor here at the university, Linfield University. And I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about this topic, racism in sport. And you know, it's a hard topic to really boil down into just, 20 or 30 minutes, but I'll try to do my best with bringing my perspective into that. And I think that sports really is one of the, most popular forms of entertainment in our world. And I think it is a kind of a microcosm and a reflection of society. And so I think it's important for us to think about it when we talk about racism and these issues of social justice. So really, I think when we think of sports, a lot of times we think of this kind of like ultimate meritocracy where, everyone's equal and it's an even playing field. And even when there's issues such as social injustice, the teams can all come together as one, and the field or the court or, anything it's a place of unity and color doesn't matter. And I think that a lot of people, they like to think about how sports is just this great platform for equality, but there are still a lot of underlying systemic things to think about when we think about sport. And I want to reflect back on kind of the films that we have for this program and how race is a social construct. It's not a biological construct. It is something that we have made up as a society based on traits and different resources and, things like skin color and hair texture. And I really like what sociologist Victor Ray has said about race, where he says it's not a thing, but race is not a thing, but a relationship between persons mediated through things. So it's constructed all through these different societal, psychological, and material resources. And it's so much more than just what meets the eye. And I think we have to think about that when we think about racism in sport. And when we think about, we're not all born into equal circumstances, and our environments and society is not a level playing field, as much as we like to believe that. And we like to think that, everyone can just raise themselves up by their bootstraps. That is not the actual reality for a lot of people. And that is also true on the sporting field, as much as we like to believe that, when everyone gets in their blocks or everyone takes the field, everyone's all equal. The backstory to how people got to that point is going to be a lot different. And sport isn't just one game or one event. It's ways in which we organize, we play, we compete among one another. And for people of color, professional sports in particular has been a mirror of America's attitude towards race. As long as Black players were restricted from playing the field, from taking the field, and the rest of Black Americans would never be truly considered equal. They would not be given equal educational or employment opportunities. And then even after they were permitted to play, sports has been this public face of America, not what we kind of profess on the 4th of July or actual daily behavior. And this is why whatever happens in sport regarding race plays out on the national stage. I think when we were going to talk last week, we just were coming off of the Super Bowl and how that is a national event. And some argue the Monday following Super Bowl should be a national holiday. There's a reason for that, because it's a societal, norm to gather and watch the Super Bowl every year. But sports also may be a good source of hope for change regarding racial disparity. And it has a good chance of really informing white Americans of disparities and motivating them to act. And a quote I heard recently from a scholar, Derek Jackson, he said, athletics allows white people to feel good about allowing Black people to participate. And that really, really hit with me. And you think about when Jackie Robinson, broke the color barrier. That was back in 1947. It was 8 years later when Rosa Parks, made her stand on the bus. And it wouldn't be until the 1960s until, you know, civil rights and voting rights were discussed. So this idea of the Black athlete being allowed to do something that, you know, white athletes were doing was like a big monumental breakthrough. And then you fast forward to present day and you see athletes like Tiger Woods being embraced by a very white dominated sport like golf. And this image just always just sticks with me. And it that quote of, you know, makes white people feel good to cheer for a Black man. And I want us to think about, as I go through this, why do we need barriers to be broken in the first place? You know, we talk about color barriers being broken, and, you know, if it's women, they're being the first of something. It's like, why do we even have these barriers in the first place? I think that's goes back to this idea of race as a social construct and how we've kind of formed ourselves into these groups in society, and how we shouldn't have these barriers in the first place. That's what's really kind of blows my mind about when we think about all these things in sport. And this is still happening to this day. We still talk about athletes and breaking different barriers, being the first, you know, LGBTQ athlete or transgender athlete. And it's like, why are these barriers there in the first place? And so I actually want to let you kind of marinate on that for a second and take you kind of back to my personal story. I, like Jenny mentioned, I grew up on the koala boundary, and this is actually my mom on the left rocking that amazing 80s hair, and my grandpa, who's one of my favorite people in the whole wide world. And there's little me in the middle. And I was really lucky growing up there. My cousin actually took this photo, and you can kind of see our little casino down there in the valley, but we were surrounded by the beauty of the Smoky Mountains. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with the geographic area, just to look at where the modern Eastern Band, right there in that little corner, kind of on the border of Tennessee and Georgia. And originally we were kind of all over the South, and we've now just to this small little area of about, you know, 10,000 people and small area land, and about 80 actually square miles now that we take up. This is I like this cool visualization of our land, because it shows the communities: Big Cove, Wolftown, Painttown, Yellow Hill, and there's a lot of community pride that comes with those communities and growing up there. But you know, this was a huge reduction into, you know, land that we were all over the South. And you know, a lot of that based on what we looked like and what people thought we were. And then I had to share a couple of photos. My mom, is actually my mom's photo from our front porch on Christmas Day when they were snowed in. So pretty lucky to grow up there and experience that. Now this is a new picture on the left of our new football field for our high school, and a picture of the downtown area. And then we also have a lot of elk in our area right now. They're kind of a nuisance, honestly. They're a big tourist attraction. But I was really lucky to grow up there, and I had such a great support system and a great community. And for us, you know, we were Cherokee. We really you know, leaned into that identity, and we were a community, and we were a tribe, and we were kind of we all knew each other, and we all did everything together, and a big part of that was sports. And so I had to throw in a photo here from when I played t-ball as a young lady. I was very much a tomboy, so I loved t-ball because I was able to play with boys and girls. It was all mixed. And then my high school got a soccer team. Our high school got a soccer team when I believe I was a junior. And so I took up soccer as a junior in high school. I really wish I would have been able to play at a younger age, but it was a great experience. And I loved sport. I wasn't good, but I loved it. And I loved the community that came from it. And I'm also really proud to talk about my great grandpa, And I had to throw in a photo here of him looking all handsome, and an actual newspaper clipping from talking about him. And I like this clipping because it shows you that my great grandpa Nick, it has the quote, like, the chief, and we joke about how anytime a native leaves the reservation, they're given that nickname of chief. It doesn't matter how many, how far they go or where they go to. And he actually went to boarding school at Carlisle Indian School and actually played baseball with Jim Thorpe. And if you're not familiar with Jim Thorpe, I beg you to Google him, because he's one of the greatest athletes of all time. So that's kind of, I always like to brag about that. But even just how they wrote about him in this article, obviously he was a lot older than his new 16-year-old bride, but that would be my great grandma and the the mother to my grandpa, and 9 other kids, who really just was amazing family to be a part of. And he also, served in the military, which a lot of people don't realize that a lot of natives serve in the military. But he was also a great athlete, and a lot that was kind of intertwined with this boarding school experience. Where when we say boarding school today, I think we think of more privileged, and it's a choice to go to boarding school. Well, this wasn't a choice for Indian children in this time. And this was, just as recent as, 50, 60 years ago. This wasn't that long ago. And so they were sent to boarding schools to be civilized. And the kind of the leader of this at the time, he, instead of trying to exterminate all Native Americans, he decided he was wanting to assimilate them and control really every aspect of their lives, and strip them away of their culture. And one piece of that, ironically enough, was sport. And it was kind of ironic in that they were, put into sport as a way to be assimilated, but they also used sport to earn respect and a chance to win, and kind of to beat the white man at his own game, for lack of better words. But it was really a transformational experience for a lot of these young Native children. And we've had famous teams in basketball and football, and a lot of this is born out of this kind of boarding school implementation of these modern sports. And just seeing again these intersections of sport and race, it's been pretty awesome for me to learn and have this experience, learning about how those intersections intertwine within my own family. And of course, when I was in high school, our high school was in the community, and it was basically all Native American or Cherokee. And so with our teams that we would play, we had rivals who obviously took advantage of that. And this isn't an actual sign from school that we played, but we faced very similar things in when I was in high school and middle school. One of my good friends reminded me that one of the schools we played, they had a coach, his last name was White. And so they would always put up white power signs when we would play them, because, it's for the coach, and it's just funny to think back now on how outrageous this was, and how it was just something that we kind of just took on the chin and kept going. We didn't dwell on it or think about it too much. It was just kind of that racism that just becomes everyday racism, and just the marginalization. And the beauty of it for us, though, was that we had each other and we had our community, and we were strong as a community together, and we got to represent our school as that community. And so I always knew I was going to go to college, which is kind of a thing I knew I was kind of bound for, but I also was nervous to leave the reservation. So I ended up going just right over the hill to the University of Tennessee. And this kind of really ignited my love of sports even more, going to a stadium with 100,000 people, and being able to be around this just like sea of orange and white, and everyone's cheering and yelling, and it's just an amazing experience. And being able to see the Lady Vols too, and Pat Summitt and Candace Parker, and all these people who were just amazing athletes and really larger than life. And one thing as I went through my school there, I started studying sport management and learning about kind of the behind the scenes of sport. And something I noticed, this was my first time off the reservation, and the majority of football players and most student athletes were Black. And most Black students, they were assumed to be athletes. And that's very common at a lot of big schools and big programs. And I don't think that gets kind of investigated enough in everyday life. And it's very much exploitative to these young men and women. And there's this tension with producing a ton of revenue for a school, but not being able to monetize off of that individually. And this is something that NCAA is grappling with right now with name, image, and likeness rights, and this whole ideal of amateurism for college athletes, especially for these Division I athletes at these big powerhouse programs where they're being, they're making millions of dollars for these institutions, and they're not, they're getting an education, but they're not getting, the full, I think, payment that maybe they should deserve, especially those students of color. And I was actually in school at the same time as Arian Foster, who is one of the more infamous players of the time, not only for his playing, but what he did after leaving Tennessee and his professional career, and his speaking out about this ideal of the free education. And he admitted to having, going to coaches and telling them, like, I need money for food. Like, I don't have enough money to pay for my own food, or it's food or rent. And he kind of retroactively got in trouble for taking tacos from a coach. And it's just like one of the most ridiculous things that you hear about. And, the education for them wasn't free because they're putting in just as much work as professional athletes. And I saw that on a day-to-day basis, how they were, going to practices, going to study halls, all these things. And they can't go make money off of their own name and off of their own likeness. And it's really a system, the NCAA, that kind of harbors this. And, and he said, they have us hoodwinked into thinking taking money is wrong as a college athlete. And he says, I would guarantee if you look at NCAA officials and the people in power, that they are riding around in their BMWs or Mercedes-Benz, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's nothing wrong with them making money off of me, but I can't make money off of myself. And I think this is one of the biggest issues facing college sports right now. Black athletes make up the majority of Division I college football, men and women's basketball rosters, and found that the audience on the flip side, on the TV audiences, were 80% majority white. And so you're having this majority white population kind of watching a majority Black population for entertainment. And the revenue for the athletic departments is going up and up, but you're not seeing that trickle down to the actual athletes. You see coaches' salaries double. I challenge you to look, if you're not in the state of Oregon, any state that you can kind of look in, usually the most highly paid public official is a football or a basketball coach. And then they're also doing all these things with, as far as facilities and upgrades and things like that. And you're seeing this really shift too, where these major sports are subsidizing the more what we call country club sports, things like rowing and tennis. And you saw with, even popular actresses getting in trouble for admissions scandals, where they wanted to get their child admitted under this kind of athletic loophole and kind of this off the books affirmative action. And a lot of times who's paying that cost is these young Black athletes who aren't given the opportunity to really make money for themselves. One image that really sticks with me is this one from an article by Bowman Jones, one of my favorite kind of authors and writers and kind of critics of sport. And he talks about the rights of an athlete and how, you know, you can go through a 400-page book from the NCAA and you're not going to see anything about rights of an athlete. It's all going to be about, you know, what they can't do and, you know, who they can't talk to or who the coaches can't talk to and those kind of things. But you're not going to see anything about the rights of an athlete. And so this photo was actually called Cotton Bowl. Thought was pretty appropriate to think about, and how the majority of the, you know, athletes who are getting, you know, just again, money is being made off of them, but they're not seeing the fruits of that themselves. And you might think, well, maybe they go on to coach or, you know, take leadership positions, but that's not always the case. And I was really lucky after attending Tennessee to go to University of Central Florida and learn from Dr. Richard Lapchick and Dr. William Sutton and Dr. Keith Harrison. And they really focused a program on looking at the power of sport, but also how we can create meaningful change. And this is where my eyes really opened to the systemic issues within sport. So it's like, yeah, okay, most of the players are Black and, you know, they're not getting paid or those kind of things. But what's the bigger, why is the system in place? And Dr. Richard Lapchick, if you don't know, I highly recommend looking into his career. He's just really been a pioneer from, you know, basically his whole life. His father, Joe Lapchick, was a basketball coach, and he saw the hate that his father got because his father, you know, was a part of integrating the NBA. And so he got a lot of hate hurled at him. And Dr. Lapchick would go on to fight for equality and, you know, really take a lot of really awful negative things, but continue to fight and fight for these actual opportunities and equality. And he founded the Tides Institute, which is responsible for creating racial and gender report cards for all of our professional leagues. So looking at the hiring practices of these different entities. And you'll see these headlines on NFL, on ESPN about the NFL or the NBA and how their hiring grades are really, really, really bad as far as looking at who they're coaching, who the athletes are, and who the coaches and the administration are. It's a big gap, and there's a lot of work to be done here. And there's a lot more. I can talk more deeper about this, but I'll go on for now. But just know that, you know, when you're given the opportunity at the, you know, the collegiate level, but then you're not given the opportunity or the opportunity to grow into the professional, like coaching and administrative level, that's a real systemic issue when you know there's representation out there. And the media is a big part of this as well. We've been kind of trained, I think, to think of Black athletes, like the film talked about, being naturally athletic and having genes or biological things that make them better athletes. And the media is kind of reinforces this with how they talk about athletes. And I challenge you to, when next time you're watching a game or an event, to listen to how they talk about athletes of different races and how they'll use words like, you know, just code words like firecracker for someone who's maybe Hispanic or Latino, or if it's a white individual, they're, you know, often thought of as being intellectual or a class act or a gym rat and a really hard worker, whereas the Black athletes are thought to be naturally athletic. And so the way the media perpetuates this systemic issues in race and sport is pretty outstanding and pretty amazing. And once you hear it, you can't really go back. It's pretty wild to think about. And then after leaving graduate school, I went on to work a little bit at ESPN Water Sports, Nike N7 up here in Portland, or in Beaverton, and then White and Kennedy in downtown Portland. And you know, these weren't, you know, while they were sport adjacent, they weren't, you know, necessarily what we think of when we think of sport, but there's the same systemic issues here with people of color and women getting opportunities. There's still very much an old boys club at a lot of these institutions. And it's not just sports, obviously, it's almost everywhere, but it was interesting to see how it was perpetuated in those different institutions for different reasons and different historical kind of ramifications there. But again, the ideal that, you know, we're all equal, not always bared out in those situations. And so some recent things I was thinking about including, I thought that this ideal of this kind of performative activism that we've been seeing a lot of, especially from the NFL, and you know, the ideas of every time this year when new coaches are being hired in the NFL, and how, you know, there's always a lack of Black coaches being hired. And more recently, there's been a lot of controversy around the NFL's concussion settlement program, where former players who have gone back to try to get kind of reparations for the damage that they were caused when they were playing the game were subject to race-based kind of adjustments, basically saying that because they were Black, they were more susceptible to these kind of problems anyways, and it wasn't the NFL's fault. And so this is something I've been following a lot recently. That's just been really fascinating to see how they try to use this ideal of race-based adjustments and kind of how we think about the medical field and different racial disparities, but almost flipping it on its head and using it against people of color to discriminate against them. And if you haven't heard, the Tampa Bay Bucks won the Super Bowl, and I thought this was a great graphic of showing the importance of diversity and how diversity can be great. You have women and men of color on this coaching staff, so you can't say that it can't be done when it's the best team in the league. And then, of course, you have the irony that often comes along with a lot of this kind of performative activism, and it's almost a commercialized activism at this point, where you see the Chiefs, who are obviously a Native American mascot, and the end racism in the same end zone. And the irony is not lost on me for sure. But the mascot issue is another lecture for another day, but I'm happy to talk about that anytime. I also wanted to bring it back local and think about what's happening in our own backyard. This was actually up at Whitman College, where a native Black woman was basically not allowed to play her sport because she spoke out about social justice issues, or what people like to say, political issues. And for people who say that sport isn't political, I just laugh, because I think everything's political, and sport is not withstanding from that. And if you're lucky enough to think that sport isn't political, I think that you're very lucky that that's the kind of this position that you're in. But for many people, it is very much a political thing. And so I think we could see this happen in our backyard here at Linfield as well. I could imagine there's a lot of donors and across the country who they like to uphold their views and beliefs through their money and their power. And again, thinking about how race intersects with sports is so embedded into our society. I have to quickly shout out to the WNBA, because they're one of my kind of favorite stories and leagues to follow. Months before Colin Kaepernick took a knee, the Minnesota Lynx wore black shirts and had press conferences where they wouldn't talk about anything but police brutality and justice for Philando Castile. And they've been, as a league, really leading the way with community partnerships, highlighting social justice initiatives. And they've really just really caused a lot of really positive awareness and change where you might not think about, and it is so much more than just basketball with WNBA. And so I'll leave you with just a thought, something to think about. Do we believe that talent is equally distributed, no matter what our race, ethnicity is? Do you believe that talent is equally distributed? I think it's easy for people to think, well, Black people are more naturally talented athletically. So, they just accept that, and kind of how the film talks about Hitler and, the Aryan race wanting to be the most dominant and then having to succumb to the Black athletes. And so, and even if it isn't equally distributed, shouldn't access and opportunity be equally distributed? And so I think that's where a lot of the issues come in, and we think about these things. And so really quickly, just a couple of recommendations. Since this is a library partnership, I had to throw out some book recommendations. I highly recommend all of these. And I can share these with Jenny and the librarians so we can get these on any list you're looking for. Also podcasts that I highly recommend that look deeper at sport and the kind of the societal issues of sport. And I think, I'm got a business grounding, but I think that the societal sociology of sport is so important to understanding the business as well. And Nelson Mandela, I love this quote, is sport does have the power. And that's why I love sport, is the positivity that can come from it. It has the power to unite people, and it speaks to youth in a way that they understand. And it really has such a potential for positive change. And I really just want to say thank you for everyone who's been listening, and thank you because, I think a lot of people, it's easy for them to kind of be naive and not think about these issues. But if I love you, I want to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And so I want to show you that these are issues. And I threw in a photo from the summer where we had a student athlete at Tennessee come up with these shirts, and this idea of, if you support Black athletes when they compete, you have to support them and their families off the field and in their kind of daily pursuits of social justice and peace. So I threw in my Twitter and my Instagram, my website, and also for all my people in McMinnville and beyond, because it's a virtual film festival this year. Starting on Thursday night, we'll be having a film festival, and I have a film on the sport of Cherokee stickball. So feel free to please check that out, and just reach out if I can help or talk about anything. Happy to keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much, Natalie. If you want to hang out a little bit, maybe we'll have time for discussion at the end. Shanna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, first, thank you, Natalie, for that fabulous talk. I enjoyed hearing about your story and your perspective on that, and I have so many questions for you later, so if we have time, that would be great. I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me here. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Maybe Natalie or Jenny can just give me a thumbs up, just to check.
We got it. Good.
Thank you very much. So what I'll do this evening is I will give you all an introduction to the biology of skin color. And I think what this can help a lot of us do is it can really help us dispel this idea of a biological concept of race. As Natalie pointed out, race is a social construct. So my hope is that I can give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the genetics and biology that regulate skin color. And first, I think to do this, it helps us to think about the wide range of skin color that we see across the globe. And I really love to use the work of the Brazilian artist Angelica Das to discuss this. She celebrates skin color variation across the globe in a very beautiful way. These are some examples of her photography. And in her project, it's called Humane, she photographed over 2,000 people from different parts of the earth and matched their skin color to a number scale, the Pantone scale, which would be used for matching colors and design and art and things like that. And so she's attempting to basically categorize people simply by skin pigmentation, not ethnicity, age, gender, location, or anything else. And this is from a few years ago. She started this in 2015, I think. So there have been some exhibits around for a while. And she says that her overall goal is to sort of showcase humanity's true colors rather than these untrue labels from the past that still persist today, like white, black, red, yellow, things that are often associated with race historically. And she's explained that she really wants to promote discussions on ethnic identity without factors like nationality, origin, economic status, aesthetic standards. And I'll just point out a couple of things about the images that she has here. So she's given everybody, like I said, a number code based on skin tone, and then she's matched the background to each person's skin tone. And I'll point out that all of the 4 people in the bottom here actually have the same exact number on her scale, and they're all from different places on the globe. So my point is that there's more in common across the globe when we think about skin color than what is different. And I'll talk about some of that today. So I'll talk about a few different things. The first thing I'd like to discuss is, how did different skin colors even evolve on Earth in the first place? Why do we see so much variation in skin color across the globe? And then I'll talk a little bit about the melanin pigments that give us this variation in skin color, how they are made in the body. And finally, I'll give you some idea of some of the genes that cause the variation that we see in melanin levels. So to do that, I want to take a step even farther back and think a little bit about just the variety of colors in the entire animal kingdom. We tend to focus so much on people, I think, in science. And so it's nice to think about something else for a bit. So we see skin and hair color varying widely across the entire animal kingdom. And in some cases, these colors and patterns provide protection, maybe camouflage from a predator. So you can see the cuttlefish here changing its color in response to a predator threat. In birds, pigmentation can serve as a mating signal. In some cases, it can serve as a warning signal to predators that eating the prey would be toxic. So in the case of the poison dart frog and the monarch butterfly. And in the case of humans, we think that skin pigmentation evolved predominantly as a response to the intensity of the sun in a particular geographic area. And to understand how that occurred, it's helpful to think a little bit about the types of melanins that exist in mammals like us. So there are actually 2 types of melanins in people and most mammals, and these give rise to all of the skin, hair, and eye color variation that we see. The first type are the brown and black eumelanins, and everywhere that you see black or brown on this cat would be an example of eumelanin. And this is the type of melanin that protects you from damage from the sun, from ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun. I'll talk more about this in a few slides. And then the other type of melanin is called pheomelanin, and this gives rise to red, yellow, orange pigments like you can see on the cat here. And anywhere that you see white is basically a lack of any melanin pigment. And the pheomelanins are not photoprotective. So by that, I mean they don't absorb ultraviolet radiation, and they correlate with a higher risk for skin cancers, especially melanoma. So this map on the left shows the array of skin color across the globe. So you can see darker skin is concentrated near the equator, and then lighter skin closer to the poles. And on the right, you can see an actual map where the melanin index in different individuals has been quantified. And everywhere that you see a very dark blue dot, that's a place where there are very high levels of melanin in the skin, which corresponds with darker skin color overall. And you can see that we have a lower melanin index as we move away from the equator. And it's thought that people evolved higher melanin content near the equator because UV intensity is very high there from sun exposure. And then as you move toward the poles, there's less intense sunlight, less ultraviolet radiation. And so people evolved lighter skin color as they moved into those areas. And traditionally, we thought that since skin cancer risk is higher in people that have less eumelanin, meaning people that have lighter skin, these would be people that live at, say, the higher latitudes on this map. It's thought that darker skin evolved as a way to protect people from developing skin cancer. But the thing about that is that skin cancer usually develops after someone's peak reproductive age. So it shouldn't really affect a person's ability to have children and pass on their skin color genes to the next generation. And when we think about how things evolved in biology, we need to think about large timescales, about many, many generations. And so that left anthropologists and biologists with the question, okay, so if it's not avoiding skin cancer, why did darker skin evolve in high UV environments? And we think the reason for that is that UV also breaks down vitamin B, folate specifically, And you might recognize folate from thinking about prenatal vitamins. A lot of women take this when they're pregnant because folate deficiency actually causes birth defects. So this would be something that could actually be linked to the reproductive success of people. And so we think that this may be why darker skin evolved in areas where UV radiation is really intense, like near the equator. But that might make you think, okay, why then don't we all have dark skin? Why did people lose darker skin as they moved to these higher latitudes? And we think that may be because UV is also required to make vitamin D, which starts in the capillaries in the skin cells. So if eumelanin blocks UV, it can block vitamin D synthesis. And people have found this in laboratory settings to be the case. And so the thought is that to avoid the negative consequences of vitamin D deficiency, such as rickets, which can cause bone weakness in children, fatigue, and increased likelihood of getting viral and bacterial infections, that people who moved north out of Africa thousands of years ago may have lost their darker eumelanin to allow for more efficient vitamin D synthesis. And as I'll talk about today, it's not always this simple. We see some exceptions to these rules, and skin color may have evolved differently in different places at different times. So thinking about how skin color evolved on Earth, in general, what we think is that global variation is linked to the ultraviolet radiation intensity in a specific geographic region. And next, what I'll explain is how some of these melanin pigments that I discussed earlier, the eumelanins and the pheomelanins, are made. They're made by special cell types in the skin. And these cells are called melanocytes. So just to orient you, what you're looking at here is a zoom in of just one section of a person's skin. And each of these sort of peach colored blocks is something that we call a keratinocyte. That's what most people think of when they think of a skin cell. This forms the layers of the epidermis. And these cells contain melanin pigments, but they don't make them. So the melanocyte is this cell right here, the one that sends out these very large projections throughout the layers of skin. And these cells are completely specialized for making melanin. That's almost the entire job of a melanocyte. And they're found in the very, very deepest layers of the skin. And what they do is they synthesize melanins, and you can see little black dots here where melanin is being made in this cell. It's actually within a specialized structure called a melanosome. Talk more about that on the next slide. And once the melanin is made, the melanocytes transfer that melanin to skin cell keratinocytes, which can store it over time. And we'll talk about how that can protect a cell from ultraviolet radiation induced damage of the DNA. And so in general, the skin pigment level in any person correlates with the amount and type of melanin that's made by the melanocyte, and then also how quickly the skin cells or keratinocytes might degrade that melanin over time. So if we zoom in on just one of these little black dots that make up sort of the melanin factories in the melanocyte, the melanosomes, and we look at them with a really, really high-powered microscope, they look something like this right here. So here's a melanosome that has made a lot of melanin. We would say that this is a very mature melanosome and is ready to be transferred from a melanocyte to a skin cell keratinocyte. And what melanosomes are something called organelles. And if you haven't had biology for a while, if you think of the melanocyte as a house, you can think of the organelle as a room in the house that has a specific function. The bathroom has a very specific set of functions. You wouldn't do things in the bathroom that you do in the kitchen, right? At least not most of those things. I have brushed my teeth in the kitchen, I guess, so maybe some things. But this compartment is just entirely specialized for the chemistry that needs to happen to make melanin. So there are enzymes in melanosomes that synthesize melanin from an amino acid. An amino acid is something that makes up a protein. So components of this would come from your diet, for example, and melanin is made from just one of these protein pieces or amino acids called tyrosine. There are a series of very tightly regulated chemical reactions that occur in the melanosome. And then once the melanosome is mature, it's made enough melanin, it can then be secreted outside of the cell and taken up by the keratinocytes. And what you're looking at here are just 3 separate images of the same set of keratinocytes or skin cells over a matter of days. And these cells have been basically fed melanin in a dish. And what happens is they take the melanin up, and right here I'm tracing the outline of just one of these skin cells. And it's actually I think one of the cutest things I've ever seen in cell biology. What these skin cells do is they put together kind of a melanin helmet or hood or umbrella right around the region of the cell that contains all of the DNA. And this is really, really important because that melanin is able to absorb ultraviolet radiation, and that's what protects skin cell DNA from UV damage. And UV-induced damage can cause cancerous mutations. Sun exposure and tanning bed use are linked to many cancers in the United States. And I'll point out also that there's a higher basal skin cancer risk in individuals who make little to no eumelanin. So we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. The other thing that's interesting is that sun exposure actually upregulates the synthesis of melanin, and then it's transferred to the skin cells. And this is a mechanism that the cell has evolved over time to protect its DNA. You might know this as something called the tanning response. So what happens is when you experience UV light from the sun, your body releases hormones that basically tell your melanocytes to make more melanin and also to spit out more melanin so that your skin cells can take it up and protect their DNA from this extra UV exposure that you've been experiencing. There's a specific hormone that regulates this process. It's called the melanocyte stimulating hormone because it stimulates melanocytes to make melanin. And it promotes only eumelanin synthesis. So the only UV dependent melanin is the brown and black type of melanin that protects skin cell DNA. The pheomelanin, which give us red and yellow pigments, don't protect skin cell DNA from UV, and UV does not stimulate production of pheomelanin. So if we think back to summarizing how melanin pigments are made, pigment cell melanocytes, there's an example of one right here. You can see lots of little black dots where there are melanosomes making melanin. This is an image that I took in the lab a few years ago. But these cells make and transfer melanin to skin cells that can then store that melanin and protect the DNA from UV damage. And the skin color that you see in any one individual comes from the type and amount of melanin made in these melanocytes. So all of the structures that we talked about on the previous slides, the melanosomes, the cells themselves, those are the same in everybody. It's really just the amount of this pigment that's made that's different. And to think about how we get those differences, we have to think a little bit about some of the genes that cause variation in melanin levels across the globe. So we'll talk about that in the next few slides. And I'll give you some examples of some new data that's giving us a more global perspective of how skin color varies. So if we look at the genes, so segments of DNA that are responsible for melanin production and skin color, there are three main types that are important for skin color variation or that are linked to skin color variation. Some of these are melanin synthesis genes. So this might be an enzyme that's needed to make melanin from the components that make it up. The second type are genes that affect melanosome structure and function. So building that organelle that we talked about that can make the melanin within a melanocyte. And then the third would be hormone signaling pathways that can affect melanin production. And I'll talk about one example for each of these types. So I'll get a little bit into the biology here. If you have questions afterward, feel free to ask. You're welcome to connect with me later if you have more questions about the specifics of the science and how it works. So the first gene that I want to highlight is something called tyrosinase. It's a melanin synthesis gene. So it's an enzyme that's directly needed to make melanin from an amino acid, again, a piece of a protein. And this one is kind of famous because it's one of the first pigment genes that was ever discovered. And mutations in this gene often cause a type of albinism, which is a complete lack of any melanin pigment in the skin, hair, and eyes. Oculocutaneous albinism type 1 is what results from mutations in the tyrosinase gene. And this is the most common type of albinism in Europe, but not so much in other continents. And in addition to that, there are a lot of what we call small nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs for short, what these are just single letter changes in the DNA sequence. So if you think of the DNA sequence as an alphabet, you could imagine just changing one letter within that code. And what these changes do, there are many of them that have been discovered, they correlate with different types of variation in skin, hair, and eye pigment. Hazel eyes, brown eyes, for example. Some of these might lead to red hair, fair skin. And I'll just point out below, the two patients on the left here are two brothers who have oculocutaneous albinism 1. So they have mutations in this tyrosinase gene. You can see that they have no pigment in the skin, hair, or eyes. And this comes with other symptoms. So we mentioned that melanin is very important for protecting DNA from UV damage. So anyone with this type of albinism is much more likely to get skin and eye cancers. And we have many, many mouse models to study genes like tyrosinase and how they influence pigmentation. So this white mouse on the left is an example of a mouse that has the same mutation in tyrosinase that humans who have oculocutaneous albinism 1 have. And some of the single nucleotide polymorphisms in this gene are also responsible for different types of skin, hair, and eye color combinations. So we're just kind of starting to learn what can cause someone to have dark skin, light hair, vice versa, different eye colors, different combinations. And there are changes in this tyrosinase gene that lead to the dark skin and blonde hair that's been found among the Solomon Islanders of Papua New Guinea and Melanesians. The second gene that I'll highlight is another one that's mutated in certain types of albinism. This gene is called oculocutaneous albinism 2, and it's actually named for the type of albinism that it causes. And this is the most common type of albinism on the African continent. So this is much less common among Europeans in contrast to oculocutaneous albinism 1. And there are also lots of changes in this gene that correlate with skin, hair, and eye pigment differences. And part of that is because this is a gene that controls structure of that melanosome organelle that we talked about. So this is very important for controlling the pH in the melanosomes, for example. That's something that's really necessary for the chemistry that has to happen to make melanin. And if you think back to high school genetics, if that's a class that you had in the past, or maybe that you have now, you always learn in genetics that brown eyes are genetically dominant over blue eyes, and so they're more common, right? It's really not that simple. So there are small nucleotide polymorphisms, again, just those single letter code changes in DNA in OCA2 that do strongly correlate with blue eyes and light skin in Africans, Asians, and Europeans, so all across the globe. But there are multiple genetic variants that can cause light skin and or blue eyes in this gene. And so I'll just point out that that might be why you've been confused about how eye color is inherited in your own family when you've tried to relate that to what you've learned in class, because in reality, there are hundreds of genes that can influence skin, hair, and eye color, and how those are inherited and passed on is not very simple. It's actually very complex. Then I'll just point out an interesting fact about this gene. So a few years back, scientists sequenced DNA from skeletons that came from pre-European populations. So these skeletons were probably about 10 to 14,000 years old. And this would be sort of middle Stone Age hunter-gatherer human ancestors. And it was found that based on their DNA sequences, these individuals likely had dark skin, dark hair, but blue eyes, which is a really uncommon combination on the European continent now. And so we tend to think of, and so here's actually an example, a rendering of what we think these folks may have looked like. And we tend to think of skin color evolving shortly after people migrated out of Africa. I mentioned in the very beginning that we think that UV is required for vitamin D synthesis, and that might be why people lost their eumelanin content over time. But it might not be that simple, because this blue eye gene was around much longer than the first light skin genetic variants that we know of, which would have arisen about 7,000 years ago. So there is a lot about how skin color evolved that we don't fully understand yet. And the third gene that I'll talk about now is one that is in that third class of genes. So this one controls the hormone signaling that's needed to make melanin. And it's called the melanocortin 1 receptor gene, or MC1R. And it's essentially the receptor for the melanocyte stimulating hormone that's released in response to UV. So the way you can think of this is the hormone is kind of like an outside signal, and the receptor is like an antenna on the surface of the melanocyte. The hormone can't get into the cell on its own, so it uses this antenna to send a signal to the cell that says, okay, UV exposure equals make more melanin. So you should upregulate melanin synthesis and transfer to skin cells now to protect your skin cell DNA. And this gene has received a lot of attention because it's responsible for a lot of the skin pigment variation that we see out there. So there are over 200 different genetic variants of this gene that have been found across the globe. The ones that have been studied the most are the red hair color variants, and these lead to fair skin, freckles, inability to tan, often red, blonde hair. And the reason that these have been studied quite a bit is that they are also associated with an increased skin cancer risk, especially the melanoma skin cancer. So I have some examples of melanomas on the bottom right here. This is a cancer that actually comes from uncontrolled growth of the melanocyte itself. So we often see asymmetrical pathological molds like these here as the melanoma develops. And what's really interesting about some of these mutations is that you might think, okay, these people don't have eumelanin, so they can't protect their skin cell DNA from damage. That must be why they're more likely to get skin cancer. It makes some sense, right? Based on what I've told you so far. But actually, folks with these genetic variants are more likely to get melanoma independent of the amount of sun that they're exposed to. So it suggests that there's something about their melanocytes internally that make them more likely to get melanoma. And I won't talk much more about that, but that's kind of what I focus on in the lab. So if anyone has questions later, I'm happy to field those. And so for the rest of the time, what I kind of just want to highlight is some newer research on skin pigment variation. So historically, a lot of the analyses of looking for skin pigment genes have been conducted only in European populations. And so it's only been very recently, and by that I mean the last 3 to 4 years or so, that scientists have started to look in other populations across the globe to see which kinds of genes correlate with skin pigment. And so some recent things that have happened that have made this a little bit easier are one, the 23andMe database. So that's one of the websites that you can send your sample to and get your DNA sequenced and learn about your ancestry and things like that. The database from all of the people that have sent their samples to 23andMe has been used for some of these skin pigment gene studies. And it's really given us a larger sample of the entire human population. And the other thing about older studies that have only been done amongst Europeans is that the European population is not very genetically diverse. So it's very hard to find new genes in this population that we don't already know about that may have an effect on skin pigmentation. And so within the past few years, a few different research groups have performed these large genome-wide studies where they sequence the entire genome, or at least regions of interest within people's DNA, and ask if certain types of variants of those genes correlate with skin color. And this has been done now in African populations, Latin American populations, and Asian populations. So we're getting a more global understanding of the genes that affect skin color across the globe. And I'm just going to highlight one of these studies that my collaborators conducted in Africa. And I've worked with them since then to look at what some of the genes do and how they affect melanocytes and melanin synthesis. And these two scientists are back at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was right before I came to Linfield, Sarah Tishkoff and Nick Crawford, shown right here. And like I said, most of the previous studies like theirs, these are called genome-wide association studies, have only been in European populations, and we haven't found a lot of new functional variants, and it gives us a really limited view of skin color variation across the globe. So if we look at their study, they conducted it completely within the African continent. And what I want to point out are a couple of things. Africa has the highest genetic variation and the highest variation of skin color across the entire globe. So the other thing to keep in mind is that Africa is the source of all modern humans. We all originated from Africa. So understanding how these genes work in this population can tell us a lot about how humans evolved as well. So if you take a look at some of the photos of the individuals from their study, you can see that, again, like I said, there is a huge range of skin color across the African continent. And there tend to be individuals with darker skin near the equator, like in the Nilo-Saharan regions. And then as you move away from the equator into Southern Africa, for example, there are much, much, much lighter degrees of skin color. So a lot of variation. And so what they did was they took DNA samples from individuals all around Africa with different skin pigment levels, and they sequenced their DNA. And then they also use something that actually allows you to quantify the level of melanin in the skin. They shine a reflectometer on the forearm, and this gives them a number scale of what someone's skin pigmentation is. And then they correlate that with the genetic sequences they find to see if they can identify genes that seem to associate with skin color differences. And I'm not going to belabor the data here. I'll just point out some of the key findings. So the first thing they found was that a lot of the same genes that have been found in European populations that influence skin color variation have also been found in African populations. So one of the ones I mentioned earlier, oculocutaneous albinism 2, that one that causes blue eyes in many people, there are also many genetic variants in that gene that are within the African population. So this seems to be a common pigment variation gene. And in fact, that seems to be mainly the case. Most of the same genes are varying within all populations that have different degrees of skin color. Another gene that they found, solute carrier family 24A5, I won't talk about what it does, but there's a single variant of this gene that is responsible for all of the eumelanin loss that we see in Europeans. And it turns out from their study that this gene is very much responsible for the light skin that we see in southern regions in Africa too. But the interesting thing is that they found some genes that we've never found before to associate with skin color. And these genes have been found in other studies within the African population by other scientists within the past year or so, and also in Latin America, Asia, and European populations too. And we're still just kind of learning what it is these genes might do. And I'll just point out that one of the genes they found, major facilitator superfamily domain containing 12, has variants that strongly correlate with darker skin pigmentation in individuals that live near the equator. And that variant is almost completely absent from lighter skinned individuals on the southern part of the continent. So these genes do seem to really strongly correlate with differences in skin pigmentation. So I want to summarize a little bit of the genetic data and just offer some perspective. So the first thing I want to point out is that the majority of genetic variation in humans is found within a population that is often considered to be the same race. So for example, I just mentioned that the highest degree of skin pigment variation is within Africa itself, within individuals all of African descent. And so is the most genetic variation. And this is true for many other traits in other populations too. So this is a pattern, not just one example. And the other thing we found is that the same genes that control pigmentation in the majority of ethnic groups across the world, right, these genetic variants all seem to correlate with geographic ultraviolet radiation intensity. And to me, what these data tell us is that they don't support a biological component of race, right? There aren't a set of genes or exact genetic variants that correlate with the socially constructed racial categories. Instead, it suggests that skin color is simply a trait that has evolved because individuals have had different geographic ancestry. And again, it's in response to ultraviolet radiation intensity. And there's no genetic predictor of whether a trait is going to be common in a specific socially constructed race category. So for example, if you were to sequence the DNA of two people from two different socially constructed race categories and compare them, there's no way that you would be able to bet, right, which group someone is part of. There's no, statistically speaking, there's not really a correlation there. You would be just as likely to find the same genes in someone of European descent as someone who is of Asian descent, for example. And in fact, there's a lot of data out there that shows just that across different groups. And the other thing I really want to point out here too, and I think it relates to some of what Natalie discussed when we think about how people have tried to classify different groups of people based on their race, right? She was talking about how this comes up in sport. People assume that all Black people are good athletes, right? For example, and she mentioned that white people are talked about as hard workers or class acts. There are all of these things that society has constructed. But in fact, skin color has no effect on any other body system or human behavior at all. So everything that we talked about today, these specific genes that control pigmentation, are simply affecting how the melanocyte and the melanosome function within the skin. And so with that, I'll come back to the outline here and just make the point that many of the genetic variants that are linked to skin color are linked to geographic ancestry and how it evolved in response to ultraviolet radiation intensity in a particular area, but not to a specific societal race category. And with that, I'm also excited to see that we're getting a more global understanding of how these skin color genes work. And that's beginning to emerge within the past few years. So there'll be a lot more data on that, I think, in the coming years. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time during the discussion.
Thank you both. And I'm not sure if Jenny is got her video with us, the other Jenny. So one of the questions that I'm often struck by is every time I fill out a form, it still asks me for my race. Do you think that that question is ever going to go away?
I'll start. I think it'll have to eventually. I just think that like Shanna was pointing out, like there's so many other ways, like geographic location, there's so many other ways to like know people, and that I think that this idea of race and ethnicity is not, it's, and for me specifically, like it's funny because like I'm technically more white than I am Cherokee, but I identify strongly culturally as Cherokee, and that is who I am. Like that's what I check, you know, but like I could easily check, you know, and people can have multiple boxes. And I think that's, I think it's a really unfortunate classification, and it gets overgeneralized for sure. So I hope it does, honestly.
I have started putting Homo sapien on some of my forms, but often the doctor's office returns them to me and says, no, you need to be a little more specific than Homo sapien.
Wow.
And then was there anything in the films that you learned something new from?
I think for me, the historical context has been something that I've learned a lot more about that through the films. And also I look forward to Leonard's talk, because I think for me, it's been very important to think about how science has historically been involved in what we now realize are socially constructed racial categories, right? So that, for me, that was one of the biggest things I took away from the films, is reflecting on that a bit and thinking more about the past and how this has come to be.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Like I kind of bit my mind to think about how science has played into this, and it all goes back to it kind of being societal and systemic, I think. And it's pretty wild. Like I know after watching, it was just like you know, it's stuff that we've seen and read, I think, but it's like when it packaged in that way, I thought it was really, really well done.
And I always get excited because I also was raised in Appalachia, like Natalie, and I went to a very conservative public high school, and we weren't allowed to study evolution or human and animal reproduction. And so I get so excited when I read about evolution, because I feel like I'm really, you know, I'm really on the vanguard there. I think my kind of favorite way that a concept was communicated in the film series Race to the Power of an Illusion is this idea that we think there's a lot of difference in human skin pigmentation, but that if you look at it from a global scale, as you move across geography, the changes are so minute. And we tend to think about Africa and Europe, but that when you span out, that you see that there really is this just incremental change in skin pigmentation as you travel the world. And I think it was one of the things that that I really liked how that film communicated. Jenny, was there anything that you learned in the films that you were pretty excited about?
Well, to be honest, yes, but it's been a little bit since I've watched the films, but I certainly learned something from Shanna and Natalie. And I was thinking, I'm not a huge sports fan, but I have found a new reason to sit and watch sports, to just listen to how race is discussed. I think that's very fascinating. And Shanna, I appreciated your enthusiasm. I was also a biology major, and I loved your enthusiasm about biology in general. And I think all of this is, the awareness. I think the awareness is such a huge part of it. So the movie, the films that were part of the race, The Power of an Illusion, and then also your discussions and all of the various readings are really, it's really about us raising our awareness about how these constructs have been used, and that they're not based on anything other than this is the system that we decided that we wanted to put into place to manage things, and that system is not necessary. It's not based on anything other than that. So I'm excited to raise the awareness from the film perspective and from the various books perspective. And Jenny, I thank you to you for bringing all of this forward as something that can be used in a for MacReads, so that it's yes, Linfield students and Linfield professors and faculty and staff, but it's so great to be able to also bring it to our community.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think that that we've come to the point in our society where we really have to look at the danger of racism for everyone. That racism is dangerous. I was raised. I always say I'm not Southern, I'm Appalachian, but I was raised in the South, and the Klan was very active, and really terrible things happened to people of all racial identities, including the assassination of a white county sheriff. And so I think that we really need to think about, and remember that, for example, my grandparents were taught in school that we were different biological races, and that if you cross-married, you would not have healthy children, right? That was their education. And many of our parents had a similar education. And so, one of the things that I think we all need to think of is, what are those concepts that live within us that we don't even think about? Things that were said when we were children, or were handed down generation to generation. And the loss that racism brings to us. So, I have a cousin I was very close to, and she married an African-American man, and she was disowned by that side of the family. And I didn't get to see her for 12 years. And that just loss within the family that was caused by racism. I really want to thank you all for tonight. I really hope that folks will join us again. In March, we're going to be reading our first book, Me and White Supremacy. And we do have some speakers almost finalized for those events. So I just really want to thank all of you for a wonderful evening and a wonderful discussion. And we'll just wish good night.
Thank you for organizing.
Yes, thank you guys. It's been great.
And nice to meet you, Jenny.
Yeah.
Oh, and these recordings will remain up on the Linfield YouTube site so that you can, if you would like, share with others or watch again.